Hello ladies and gentlemen, Philosophossum. You may have noticed I sound slightly differently from how I normally do. The mic I typically use stopped working, so I'm using a headset mic that I use for teleconferencing at work. Also, you may have noticed I haven't released videos in a while. That's because I recently started a new job, I had to move to another state, I had a big project due for work, so for a variety of reasons my video output has been less than ideal. But now that I'm settled in with my new job and everything, hopefully I'll be able to start releasing videos on a more consistent basis. That being said, without further ado, let's debunk some social contract nonsense.
All right, it's the debut of our audience questions segment. This will be, instead of just some quick voicemails at the end of the show, we'll actually take some questions. Janelle wrote to us. She said, I hear from my conservative friend that taxes are slavery and theft. I'm never really sure how to counter this.
If you're not sure how to counter the argument, then how are you certain that the argument is to be countered? You're supposed to have your arguments formulated before you draw your conclusion. Doing it in the reverse order makes your arguments much more susceptible to confirmation bias.
Okay, this is a very popular libertarian argument, which is that taxes are theft because as the taxpayer, you've not opted in to the system of paying taxes, and that you're choosing to work and taxes are just being taken from you.
Well, theft is by definition taking someone else's property without their consent. If I've never agreed to it, if it's just imposed upon me, then by definition it must be theft. You may believe there's some basis to justify it, but that doesn't change the underlying logic. If the government doesn't get your permission before taking your money, then that's still by definition theft.
And that if you don't pay them, ultimately the government will show up with guns and take you to jail if you don't pay.
Right, they're obtaining money from you by threatening to inflict violence on you if you don't comply. This is what robbers and muggers do. The fact that they may be wearing a badge instead of a ski mask doesn't change the underlying morality and logic. It's a non-consensual transaction, plain and simple.
So that it is a form of theft. They are stealing your wages and or slavery.
Well, as far as the government is concerned, they're entitled to a portion of your labor. If someone else is entitled to labor you perform against your will, even only partially so, that is slavery.
This is ridiculous. So the best way to go about this is to say, listen, number one, taxation is part of a social contract, okay?
Can I see a copy of this social contract? I don't recall having ever seen it, let alone signed it.
So you're paying for taxes in exchange for services from the government.
Well, that's all fine and dandy, but suppose I don't want the government services. Can I peacefully opt out?
And if you are to say, well, I never personally opted into that system, you did in one of two ways. You were either born in this country, now your parents had legal custody of you as a child, and therefore by choosing to birth you in the United States, they opted you into the social contract.
So what you're telling me is that someone being born at a certain location can be construed as that person having consented to something? So suppose a mother gives birth in an apartment building. Would that landlord then have a basis to impose the lease onto the child?
If you disagree with that, then you must disagree with the concept of parental custody, in which case you would be arguing that 3-year-olds should be legally independent of their parents. Very few people would do that, even libertarians.
So because children aren't competent enough to enter into agreements on their own, parents are vested with a limited power to enter into agreements on the child's behalf. However, once the child does reach that age at which they're competent to make decisions on their own, any previous agreements that the parents may have made on their behalf is now void, and a new agreement has to be drafted.
If you weren't born here, then when you moved to this country, or if you were a minor, when your parents chose to move you to this country, again, you agreed to the social contract in which taxation exists.
Simply being in a particular location can't be construed as consent. A landlord can't impose a lease onto you simply because you had stepped onto their property by accident. Now, the landlord could ask you to leave his property if you don't intend to lease with him, but in order for that lease to be binding, there has to be something over and above simply physically being on the property.
Putting that aside, going beyond the fact that you agreed to the social contract.
Well, you say I agree to the social contract, but your basis for establishing this agreement is dicey at best.
There are actually many options that you have. You can say, all right, I don't like the social contract with taxation, so I'm going to work to amend it. You have that option. You could work to change the social contract.
And how, pray tell, am I supposed to change a contract that I can't even see or know anything about?
If you don't think you would be successful, well, that's because other people may not agree with you.
Why should the opinion of other people have anything to do with it, though? Why shouldn't I be free to adjust the terms of the social contract for me as I see fit? Is the same social contract that's subservient to the will of the majority also the same social contract that's binding the minority upon the will of the majority? If so, that's kind of a catch-22. In order for the social contract to be binding on the minority, it would have to first be subservient to the will of the majority. But in order to be subservient to the will of the majority, it must be imposing upon the minority against their will. I suppose you could get around this by having a separate social contract that first binds me to the will of the majority. I mean, there is pretty much equal basis for the existence of multiple social contracts as there is for one. In fact, since the social contract is this mystical, metaphysical contract, there's really nothing saying there can't be infinite social contracts. If I don't need to verify that one social contract exists, there's no more need to verify that a million social contracts exists. Heck, for all I know, I could be breaking 20 different social contracts right now and not even know it.
That they would rather have no government services in exchange for paying no taxes.
Or how about this? What if the people who wanted government services and were willing to pay the taxes for them can go ahead and do that, and the people who don't want to use any government services can just peacefully opt out of taxation? The mentality behind democracy is very strange to me. Like, everybody in this area has to do the same thing.
You could leave the social contract where taxation exists by going to a different country.
Well, the government doesn't own all the property within its territory, which would have to be the case in order for the don't like it leave argument to work.
Now, if you come back and say, well, other countries have taxes too, that's their problem. That has nothing to do with the U.S. having taxes.
Yeah, I'll remember that next time you start clamoring on for universal health care and social democracy. Who cares what they do in Canada, Denmark, or Sweden? It's none of America's business what happens in other countries.
You could violate the taxation social contract by just choosing not to pay your taxes and then take your chances, right? You do have that choice. It may not work that well for you.
Well, with cryptocurrency on the rise, it's simply becoming easier and easier to hide your assets from the IRS.
Or you could ultimately try to revolt against the government, which people have done historically. That may or may not work well.
There's also agorism, the idea of doing business around the state, thus starving it of resources, essentially accomplishing the same end as a revolution, minus the violence and bloodshed.
So this idea that people are forced into paying taxes unilaterally with no agreement is ridiculous, isn't it, Lou?
Yes, it is ridiculous, which is why the government should stop doing it.
It is ridiculous. I suggest, if you want to put it simply to them, say, well, why don't you just move to a country that has no taxes, list a few of them off, see if they like the sound of that.
Yeah, Monaco and the Cayman Islands. Both countries have a very high standard of living, and foreign investment pours in like rain. I'd recommend you take a hint or two, but after all, it's none of America's business what happens in other countries.
And tell them that if there never were any taxes, they'd probably be speaking German right now.
Yeah, getting a fighting force large enough to conquer the entire US across the Atlantic Ocean would have been a huge pain in the ass. Yeah, Hitler himself knew this. Why do you think he made allies with Japan? But even if this were true, there's more than one way to possibly fund a military or organize a defense force. Since you bring up the example of World War II, one of the reasons the Japanese were reluctant to invade the mainland US wasn't even because of our military, it was because of private gun ownership. And if it would be bad for an external totalitarian regime to impose their will onto us, would it make any sense to say in order to prevent that we should have one of our own?
Tell them that too. See how they respond to that.
Some libertarians will say that if there is a contract, it needs to be physically signed. Take them to a restaurant, have them order food, and see if they think it's okay to walk out without paying.
So this restaurant analogy is commonly used to get across the idea that the social contract is a form of tacit consent. Tacit consent, or a tacit agreement, is an agreement which is mutually understood by the parties, although not explicitly stated. The reason the restaurant analogy is used so frequently is because restaurants are the most common example of a tacit agreement that we typically get involved with on a regular basis. So when you eat at a restaurant, there's a mutual understanding between you and the servers that you will agree to pay whatever price is listed on the menu in return for whatever you eat. There's no contract that you sign before you place your order. You never raise your right hand and solemnly swear to pay for whatever you eat. It's a mutually understood agreement. And proponents of the social contract argue that the social contract is one of these tacit agreements, things that, although aren't agreed to overtly, is mutually understood between all the parties. is they argue that there's a mutual agreement that between you and the government that by living within the government's territory, you tacitly agree to be taxed and obey laws and whatever the case may be. Here's the thing though, even in a tacit agreement, all of the criteria needed to have a legitimate agreement still applies. There still has to be a meeting of the minds, there still has to be a decision made of one's own free will. Both parties have to understand the terms of the agreement, and of course you can only ever agree to do something you actually have the right to do. So even if the social contract was one of these tacit agreements, there are still certain things missing that make a agreement legitimate. I've never done anything to overtly consent. The terms of the agreement are made rather unclear, and the government, as part of their terms of the contract, claims the ability to do things that people don't actually have the right to do. For example, make rules for property they don't own. So even if I were to accept that the social contract were a form of tacit consent, this in and of itself still wouldn't be enough to legitimize it.
Because, hey, social contract, smotional contract, there was no physical contract signed here. I don't owe any money for the food I ordered, right? I mean, that's essentially what you're saying if you say it needs to be a written contract that I physically sign.
Well, in the case of a restaurant, there's a menu that lists out what the restaurant serves and what the price is, so that anyone choosing to patronize that restaurant understands what it is that they're obligated to compensate when they order what. Or in the case of a buffet, they're only obligated to pay once, and then from there can eat as they please on that same visit. So even though there's no official overt agreement on paper, there's still something physical on record that can be used to determine how much I owe and for what. So if you're comparing the social contract to a restaurant, well, does the government have some kind of menu? Does the government list out what services they provide and what they charge? See, I personally wouldn't mind a system of taxation where I got to, say, pick and choose what government services I wanted, but under this so-called social contract, you don't really have much of a say in that matter. Do you send your kids to a private school? You're still stuck paying for public education. Get healthcare from your employer? Guess what? You're still stuck paying for Medicare. Have an IRA? Guess what? Still stuck paying for Social Security. Don't like cops and military beating the shit out of innocent people? Well, guess what? Too bad, here's the bill.
So, excellent question, Janelle. Very juvenile argument, really, from the libertarian side on that.
You're using the word juvenile as a personal attack without really knowing what it means. Now, when you argue that the state should have all these responsibilities because people can't be trusted with their own freedom, you're essentially ascribing to the state a role of paternalism, which is actually, by definition, juvenile.
This is viewer-supported independent media.
And so is this, which is why links to my Patreon and PayPal will be in the description. Hope everyone enjoyed their St. Patrick's Day, a little luck to keep you safe from the coronavirus. And on that note, this has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.